Another fatal flaw for liberal leadership and government is that its pacifist upbringing is not prepared to deal with the mass evils out there in the world. Liberalism is ill-equipped to run Western society because not only is it bad on domestic issues, but international issues as well. Liberalism is deep-rooted in its pacifism, but the liberal belief in pacifism is only because it comes from the working class, a class that does not have the means to use force, so as a result it uses manipulation, deceit, and rhetoric. But pacifist ideals and disarmament initiatives, and those like it, are to the relative advantage to the side with inferior arms. If I have no weapons and you have many, it will also prove a very useful belief if I can get you to share it sufficiently to lead you to throw away your big bombs and unload your revolvers.
President Failure could not or would not conclude a simple status of forces agreement in Iraq, so American troops walked away. Actually, they were ordered to walk away from a hard-won victory and allowed the last vestiges of the ravaged and defeated AQI, that'd be Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to recover in the absence of American strength, just enough to rename itself ISIS. And now that we've created the Iraq war defeat that President Failure and his treason party had promised the American people, we are quietly sending more troops back to Iraq and to Syria and Libya and Afghanistan, all to try to make up the ground that President Failure has not just lost but actually thrown away.
As the 19th century French writer summed up the general law of political dialectic, when I am the weaker, I ask you for my freedom because that is your principle, but when I am the stronger, I take away your freedom because that is my principle. The more my opponent is affected by pacifist ideas and feelings, the better it is for me, and this fact is so unquestionable that the propaganda and psychological warfare services of all modern governments have deliberately promoted pacifism among the enemy armies and civilian populations. Several of the governments have included in their war preparations a preliminary sowing of pacifist ideas and prospective enemy quarters. Pacifist-tending ideas are being pressed not by the nations with inferior arms in order to weaken the stronger, but by the stronger in order to weaken themselves, to sacrifice their relative advantage and thereby to lessen their ability to defend their interests and ideals. This disarmament pacifist trend in Western opinion is also self-imposed, of the Western sense of guilt at the immensity of its own power, which is why the United States and other Western allies have the power to destroy these radical Islamist nations, but does not have the will to do it. The long-term secular trend of the United States foreign policy has been, since the very earliest years of the Cold War, towards ever-increasing softness. George Sorrell, on his book Reflections of Violence, says, quote, "The optimist in politics is an inconstant and even dangerous man, because he takes no account of the great difficulties presented by his objects. He is not long in finding out that social transformations are not brought about with the ease that he had counted on. He then supposes that this is the fault of his contemporaries."
Islam is not part of the problem in combating violent extremism. It is an important part of promoting peace. The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents. We have reaffirmed again and again that the United States is not and never will be at war with Islam. Islam teaches peace.
Liberalism and the ideas, sentiments, and values to which liberalism gives priority are not well designed for the stark issue of survival. The optimistic view of mankind is a false claim based on all of the evidence of human history on every continent, on every society. The liberal flight from reality is headlong on every front. The optimistic view of society is silly, naive, and childlike view of the world. But the liberal is more content with a self-generated dream world than a distasteful reality.
American Muslims have enriched the United States. Islam has always been a part of America's story. We will convey our deep appreciation for the Islamic faith, which has done so much over the centuries to shape the world. I also know civilization's debt to Islam. It was Islam that carried the light of learning through so many centuries, paving the way for Europe's Renaissance and Enlightenment. Islamic culture has given us majestic arches and soaring spires, timeless poetry and cherished music, elegant calligraphy, and places of peaceful contemplation. They have fought in our wars, they have served in our government, they have stood for civil rights, they have started businesses, they have taught at our universities. And when the first Muslim American was recently elected to Congress, he took the oath to defend our Constitution using the same Holy Quran. In ancient times and in our times, Muslim communities have been at the forefront of innovation and education. It is important for Western countries to avoid impeding Muslim citizens from practicing religion as they see fit. And I consider it part of my responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they appear.
The liberal doctrine and habit demonstrate their inability to meet the challenges that face the Western world. Liberalism cannot even quite come to terms with its own power, and especially military force. But this does not mean that their pacifism prevents the liberal from exercising force at times. They will exercise our military forces from time to time, but they're so unaccustomed to force that when they do choose to use force, they often use it at the wrong time and the wrong dosage for it to be effective. And as liberal civilians move into positions of governmental power in a nation with a tradition of civilian supremacy, they begin to make deliberate moves to alter the military mind according to liberal prescriptions by suitable indoctrination and censorship, demotions or dismissals of stubborn anti-liberals, and manipulation.
You know, people don't remember, when I came into office, the United States in world opinion ranked below China and just barely above Russia. And today, once again, the United States is the most respected country on earth.
So Barack Obama's measurement of good U.S. foreign policy is not are America's interests moving forward, but what do foreigners think of us? He's not just driven by polls in the United States. In this case, his explicit measurement is what do others think of us? But it's surely not true. I mean, do you really think that Russia has more respect for the United States now than 6 years ago? Russia laughs at the United States. It marched into Crimea with impunity. Do you really think China has more respect? How would you even measure that in China, a semi-totalitarian regime with no free press? Do you think people answer pollsters freely? How do you measure in Africa what they think? How do you measure in Egypt, a country that's being roiled by the Muslim Brotherhood? What does it even mean? But Barack Obama is hanging his hat on some poll that says he's better loved than George Bush by foreigners. Well, here's a secret. Foreigners always love a weak America in retreat.
Liberalism themselves know that a nation couldn't survive if all of its military might and instruments of force disappeared overnight. But the liberal doctrine and ideology itself doesn't account for this. It cannot do so, because theoretically recognizing the necessity of this force presupposes a pessimistic theory of mankind, or at the very least a rejection of the optimistic view of liberalism. But force is necessary because there are unchangeable limits, evils, and defects and irrationalities in human nature which result in clashes of interests and egos that cannot always be resolved by peaceful, rational discussion, negotiations, compromises, or more education. Because a more pessimistic view of human nature will typically understand this and plan in advance how to use force if negotiations fail, so that force can be used at a minimum to get the job done. But liberalism's ideology is prevented from acknowledging the necessary role of force, and by his temperament, resists and dislikes planning ways force may be used ahead of time. As mentioned, liberals are more foxes than lions. They belong to professions that seek to achieve their goals of shrewdness, deception, and experts in rhetoric. What happens then when liberals become influential in the affairs of nations is that their government tries to handle the issues and threats they are faced with through the same cerebral methods and shy away from using force, mostly operating on the threat of force as opposed to actual force. They bluff, and as they bluff, it reflects poorly on their nation's will to fight, and the bluff will be called the next time and the next. What's remarkable about this is the liberal leader uses just enough force to create the worst outcome.
When Jimmy Carter pulled the Persian rug out from the Shah of Iran, oops, he got Khomeini. He didn't know he was going to get somebody who would be congenitally hostile to American foreign policy, so he was surprised. But when Obama supports the Muslim Brotherhood, he knows that this is the oldest and most powerful organization of radical Islam in the world. He knows that the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to consolidate its power not only in Egypt, but throughout the Middle East. And yet, when the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power, Obama doesn't seem perturbed. In fact, he seems kind of excited.
It's the reason why, we've are moving in the direction of normalizing relations with Cuba. The nuclear deal that we're trying to negotiate with Iran.
Hey, I got a question for you. Do you actually think that the wars have ended in Iraq and Afghanistan? The wars ended? I think the wars have just begun anew because Barack Obama abandoned those countries prematurely. And so the Islamic State has conquered half of Iraq, half of Syria, is now active in Libya, another country that Barack Obama helped topple. Do you think the war is over in Afghanistan? There are suicide bombs there every day. The war is not over there. Obama simply abandoned and surrendered. In the city of Mosul alone, 2,300 U.S. built armored Humvee vehicles have been seized by the Islamic State. That's not ending the war, that's running away.
Worse than war and worse than submission is the half war, where people die, the war drags on, and the public loses its will to continue, like the Bay of Pigs or Vietnam. The force used in South Vietnam is considerably greater, but no less unsurely and inconsistently applied. It is enough to keep the country in turmoil and to make sure that a good many people, among them Americans, get killed, but not enough and not used properly to defeat the communists. It should not be inferred from examples such as these that liberals never turn to all-out use of force, merely that they seldom turn to the right amount of force at the right time.
In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, who turned over his nuclear and chemical weapons program the day after U.S. forces pulled Saddam Hussein from his hiding place, well, Gaddafi was overthrown and Libya became such a chaotic bloodbath that U.S. forces found themselves aiding al-Qaeda on the battlefield.
But this softness, this pacifism, and the optimistic view of mankind is bad for Western society, and it continues to prove that. The United States spends $1 trillion annually fighting poverty, hundreds of billions on illegal immigration, but these problems are only growing, because the liberal does not have the goal to hold people accountable or to say no. It cannot hold people accountable for failure, because that would violate the liberal belief that the world's ills are the result of ignorance and not something innate in mankind. This naivety becomes worse in international dealings. It is just as silly to discuss peace with communists or radical Islamic nations, to speak in terms of democracy with Muslim nations, or to imagine that you can stop the clock of scientific technology by signing test ban agreements is stupid. Liberals are incapable of running government in these areas because in order to be fully trenched in the protection of Western civilization against communism and terrorism would be rejecting the optimistic view of mankind as all one common man, and they would have to assert that Western man is different from the non-Western and even superior to the non-Western man. The liberal is incapable of having a steadfast conviction that the use of superior force to defend the West against its enemies, because unless Western civilization is superior to other societies, it is not worth defending with its superior force. By its very own principles, the liberal cannot wholeheartedly defend the West or make effective use of the power of superior forces. We see nations in Europe who harness their weapons and let third world Muslims take over their country. We see terrorist organizations growing and advancing, and the more powerful West, driven by liberalism, paralyzed, unable to muster up the will to fight back. Liberalism is incapable of defending itself from any member to the left of them. The willingness to allow covert terrorists into our countries in the name of political correctness is a good example. Its inability to use the words radical Islam when terrorist activities occur shows the left has no energy to fight any opponent other than the right.